All right, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for sacrificing a little bit of your time, a little bit of your sunshine. It's a beautiful day out there, so I'll try to make this worth it for you, not waste anybody's time. If you were able to join the last time, we covered some introductory tools and some tool usage, so this will kind of be building on that. We're definitely not going to get to agents by any time at the end of this today, but maybe that'll be some future workshops. So today we are really kind of focused on a few different offerings, once again, from Google's Gemini suite of tools, mainly Canvas and then Gems. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we will kind of pick up where we left off in terms of prompting too, get back into that, except we will get a little bit more advanced with our prompting strategies. So if everybody would be so kind as to get the slides from this link right here. You could take a picture. Might be a little bit difficult off of your computer there or using your phone. But if you go to this site, you should be able to download today's slides. They are in a PDF format just because it was pretty big as a PowerPoint or a set of Google Slides. So try to condense it, but all of the information is on there. So take a moment to do that while we're gearing up. All right, so hopefully you're there. If not, maybe you can ask your neighbor or somebody near you to get the information. We'll keep chugging along here. So last time, we really kind of focused on the different models themselves within Gemini. This will be focused exclusively on Google Gemini. I know a lot of people use Claude. I think Claude is great. Today, we're just going with Google tools. We talked a little bit about matching different data types and different sensitivities for those data types and different privacy tiers and kind of thinking about how or when or if we should upload different types of data into these tools. We started out prompting and we used the crafts framework. We'll revisit that a little bit to help us structure some prompts, and that's kind of where we started off. We'll build on that as well. And then we kind of wrapped up with utilizing Notebook LM, and we kind of used this as a RAG tool so we could build a knowledge base, kind of store some of those documents that are important to us so that we could ground our sources and our outputs from those sources. So today, to take the next step, what we're going to look at is those advanced prompts that I had mentioned. And then we're going to kind of consider some critical thinking while using Google Gemini's Canvas tool. And then we'll also explore gems, what they're used for, building one, and then also maybe how you could reduce environmental impacts while using them. So we will talk a little bit about critical thinking in the age of AI today, as well as some of those environmental impacts tied to AI once again. And then we will wrap up, as always, with a little bit of a bookend. So something that you kind of learned today, and then something that you're hoping to learn going forward that maybe wasn't talked about, or maybe you were inspired to think about, and you'll just share that with the group that you are in. So just a couple of reminders again, this is a low stakes practice, right? So this is not going to be any type of a test or anything like that. This is sheerly just for you to learn. All right. So ask out loud if you have any questions, ask the people near you. This is going to be something where you are doing a lot of the work. I'm kind of steering it a little bit, but mostly it'll be a lot of conversations amongst the groups themselves. And then you should always think about when you're using these tools being skeptical and really exercising that skepticism muscle, because you can't trust every single output or any output as ground truth right off the bat, right? So you always want to evaluate, make sure, just because at the end of the day, your name goes on the paper, whatever you're doing, you have to be responsible for it, right? Okay. Again, we will be working in groups. I don't care if you work in groups of 2 or 5. The more the merrier. Doesn't matter to me, but we're doing this for a few different reasons. Number one, promotes collaboration. Most of science is done in groups or to help one or a few different people within a group learn different structures. So we're here to learn together, right? You want to be a rising tide that lifts all ships. There are definitely going to be some people in here with a lot more experience with AI and some that are still kind of learning it. So if you can help, please do. And then finally, Gen AI queries, they do have environmental costs, right? So if we are doing work as a group, then we will be cutting down on those costs by running fewer prompts and receiving fewer outputs. And just a reminder, since we are going to be using the Google suite of tools, to make sure that you are considering the types of data that Google's Gemini is approved for through the University of Michigan. Quote unquote, some moderate data sensitivity is approved through U of M, and you can kind of see a smaller picture here. You'll be able to blow it up on the set of slides that you can look at on your own computer. But then if you do have questions about sensitive data types, you can always go to this link right here. They do a pretty good job and also give some role-specific examples. spelling out those different types of data and when you should not use these tools. And then please do make sure that you are operating with the secure version of Gemini, especially if you're going to be using different data types through the University of Michigan. And this is usually a pretty good indicator right here within your chat window when you log into your U of M account and look at Google Gemini. You'll have this little lock and key shield right next to your prompt or your chat window there. And then you'll also have a little phrase down here that says your U of M chats aren't used to improve our models. Gemini is AI and can make mistakes. That said, still be mindful of the data that you're putting in. Just because this is listed at the bottom doesn't mean it is approved for all data types by any means, right? And then when you are uploading data, consider these 4 questions, right? Will this data harm others? If it's shared, will this negatively impact my ability to do science or my job? Does this data contain information that doesn't exist anywhere outside my lab or maybe my work practice yet? And then finally, if this output appeared verbatim, this is mostly towards research, if it appeared verbatim in a competitor's grant 6 months from now, would that be a problem, right? If so, probably shouldn't upload it, okay? All right, so cut down on the number of exercises today. We definitely didn't even get through all of them last time, but we do have these 4 listed here. We will do a little bit of a diagnostic consult, talk about some controversial hypotheses, do a little bit of a gem gauntlet, and then wrap up with that bookend, all while using Canvas, gems, and then kind of some prompting techniques. So let's start out with advanced prompting, right? We left off, we were kind of just setting ourselves up using different prompting strategies to kind of build off of our initial start with all of this. So how is it that we improve the way that we communicate with large language models in general, right? Or prompting, essentially. And the last time we talked about this, the CRAFTS prompting framework, which stands for context, role, action, format, taboos, and steps, right? So if you weren't here the last time, this is essentially just the minimum, more or less, that you want in order to get some really solid outputs when using these tools. And it kind of answers this question, really, that approach, which is what's the absolute minimum an LLM needs to be useful? And within that CRAFTS prompting strategy, if we think about it, we definitely had some zero-shot prompting, which means that you really don't give it any examples at all. You just simply ask it a question. Maybe you give it even a persona or a role, and that can really influence the output of it, right? So there is a little bit of a benefit for some of these, zero-shot being that that's just best for simple, immediate tasks where you don't need a lot of in-depth reasoning. You just need a quick response. But then role prompting, it really helps because it shifts token probability towards specialized vocab and tone for those outputs, right? So if you say you're an expert bioinformatician or you are a 3rd grade science teacher, it's really going to dictate the output in the language that's used. Okay, so if we want to go a step further, though, we can ask the question, how do we improve the way we communicate with LLMs to reduce errors and ask these tools to show their work, right? So now we're trying to go a little bit deeper. And there are quite a few different strategies. Honestly, there are probably over 100 different strategies, but I just pulled some that are pretty relevant where papers have come from to kind of get you thinking about the different ways that you can interact with these tools. So we have few shot prompting, just when I mentioned zero shot, which is no examples. Few shot means you give it a couple examples, right? Maybe a little bit of a structured output, 2 or 3 different kinds, and that gives you a pretty good output because it gives it structure overall. It gives you a complex, rigid output if it is copying one of those examples you give it. We also have rereading. Maybe some people haven't really heard of this one. We're starting to get a little bit more into the minutia of some of these strategies that are out there. But this would be where you are trying to have it look again at the input that it receives in order to make sure that it really doesn't miss anything. So it's going to improve the attention to detail, especially in those long, dense prompts. Gemini is a good example because you can have a million token context window, which means that it's really, really long. When these models first started becoming popular, it was very common for the middle of the output or the input to be ignored, right? And they would kind of just gloss over the intro, and then they would give you some solid results for the end just to make it look like, okay, it summarized the whole thing. We've shied away from that, but this is still a viable strategy because it's going to help with the attention to detail. One that's really, really popular for good reason is chain of thought. And then also off of that, there's program of thought. And these help to answer the question, which is the LLM thinking, right? We kind of don't want to anthropomorphize any of that stuff, but is the LLM thinking? And then how do we get the model to show its work and reduce statistical errors? So with chain of thought, this is a way to kind of provide better transparency for human verification. And there have been a lot of papers, actually quite a few from Anthropic, who is the creator of Claude. And they've really kind of pointed to the fact that these reasoning models, they often don't say what they think or the operations that they're doing in order to give you an output, right? And that can be really problematic if, for science especially, we want reproducibility. We want to be able to trace how we got that output. So a variation of this, and you'll notice that as we go on, these kind of just become variations of one another, small tweaks, but they can make a big difference. We have program of thought, and what this does is it actually separates reasoning from computation, and that's going to reduce a lot of the calculation errors. And there was a paper by Chen et al., and it's a couple of years old already, but it still holds up for the most part, depending on your goal. So then if we wanted to say or ask the question, how do we get LLMs to explore multiple branching paths and backtrack when it hits a dead end, right? We really want to explore or cover a lot of ground, kind of think a lot about the different strategies that are out there that may apply to our question. We can use something known as step back prompting, which is telling us, or telling the tool rather, that it should take a step back, identify the high level concepts before tackling granular details. And what that does is it helps to prevent tactical confusion when it is making a plan or doing that reasoning. And then if we look over here at tree of thoughts, what you'll see is that we really start to get this segmentation or branching, as you can imagine here. And what that does is it enables look ahead logic. And that it also backtracks if a reasoning path reaches a dead end. So it can be really exploratory. If it finds that a branch isn't viable, it will come back, and then it will kind of just use these other branches, and then it'll give you the final answer depending on which one makes the most sense.
Can I ask a question?
You can. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, these are really neat and more sophisticated. They have a certain structure to them.
They do.
You know, and the question is, how much of that structure are we, as the prompter, responsible for? And how do we best implement these more sophisticated prompting methods? That's related.
I will say that it, and I hate to say it to be a broken record, but it certainly depends on your goal, right? How wordy do you have to be? I would always advise for people to be as concise as possible, not only for the environmental impacts, but simply because you don't want to give these tools any more slack than they already have and being generalists. So you really want to be specific.
So specific. I mean, you know, you have principles on the step back. I mean,
I'll actually provide examples.
Well, yeah, then I can wait.
So I'll have examples for the exercise.
This will be good because I think this will, you know, just translating what these like conceptually are to actually how you do them.
And I do want to point out too, so I always mispronounce his name. Is it Andre Karpathy, the co-creator of Cloud Code?
Yeah.
He always says, especially for coding practices, that you want to be as direct as possible and you don't need to do all of this work. For that, though, I will say that's specific to coding, and this would be more general logic building.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, these prompt schema are, you know, a lot of them are in there now as at least skills. You could imagine these being skills.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so it could be as simple as that could be a way to do them.
You could even make them a gem, which we might talk about in a bit.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, though, and a good point. I'm glad you brought it up. Other thoughts or questions, concerns? All right. Yeah, go ahead.
So you're about to use Gemini. Do you think Gemini knows all these prompt engineering?
I think it does, in the sense that it would recognize just the term itself, and it would be able to find it pretty quickly.
Right. So that'd be a way, and that's a smarter way, Greg, to ask my question. You know, because you could just say use a step back prompting strategy.
Absolutely.
And then in Gemini or, you know, Anthropic, somebody would likely would have that in.
Yeah, and I think that would be wise to do going forward after you see what they look like. Right? Because you need to know what the structure looks like to say, if it does not make sense for what you're about to do.
Yeah, so the key is, and it's something, one thing that's somewhat missing from this that would be really good, and the examples are going to help, is when what you want to do, step back prompting versus tree of thought versus this versus that. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So AJ,
go ahead.
What does that do for the cost of your prompts? If you say reread, does it charge you double?
I would essentially imagine yes. Yes, it does, right? So not only do you want to be concise with the language, but you want to be concise with the logic. And what's nice about making a gem, which we'll talk about later, is that you can essentially avoid all of that repetition by just making this gem and then you just talk to it. And it's going to think about things in a step back prompt every single time, right? So then you're kind of saving on that point. But it is a valid question, something that I think about a lot. And we'll talk a little bit more about environmental impacts with one of the exercises as well, trying to cut down at the different levels, whether that be policy all the way down to the user.
So is this, if you're using a harness through the API, is kind of this taken care of for you, some of this prompting and chain of thought type things?
I think so, depending on what type of logic you want to use, whether there's some type of default logic that these models typically use. I imagine chain of thought reasoning is a big one just for the reasoning itself. But maybe you do want a more specified way to explore, whether that be tree of thoughts or something that I'll show on the next one, which would be like self-consistency. So it's kind of doing its own logic checks. But as I'm sure you know, like agents, they are pretty good now at that in this idea of working in loops. They can do a lot of that recursive thinking. Good questions. All right, I want to make sure we get through it all. Good questions. Let's see here. So as I just mentioned, there's two other types of pretty popular prompts out there, and they answer the question, how do we turn the LLM into its own editor to audit its own logic? And those would look like self-correction prompting and then also self-consistency prompting. So self-correction is essentially you just force the model to become its own editor, right? So it's kind of doubling back, but there is a cost associated with that, as Ken brought up, so always think about that. But it does help to minimize some false positives in your outputs. And then finally, we have self-consistency prompting, which is a good way to aggregate multiple reasoning paths to find a more statistically reliable answer. So it kind of works through just like a tree of thought would, except it is looking for or uses a vote to come to a consensus on the best path instead of simply providing all of those paths for you. It votes on the best one. Okay, so like I said before, this is going to be largely everybody working with one another. Again, looking for groups of at least two, but they can be larger if you want to save energy and promote collaboration. What we're going to do is I'm going to give you a case study here, and you will use one of the advanced prompting strategies on the following slides. You'll use two of them actually as a group, and you'll kind of go through this logic. You'll use that advanced prompting strategy in order to see the outputs that it gives you. And you can even compare that to a simple prompt that you would do without any of this advanced prompting and see what the differences are, right? This will kind of give you a little bit of a peek into how these outputs change with the inputs. Okay, so the case scenario is that you guys will be talking and thinking about a computational biology lab has been asked by their university's research integrity office to evaluate whether a junior postdoc's use of AI in a manuscript constitutes a research integrity violation. So these are the facts that we have. The postdoc used an LLM to generate a method section, then ran the described experiments and obtained results consistent with the AI-generated protocol. The method section was not disclosed as AI in the AI assisted in the manuscript. The data appears real. The results replicate. No fabrication is suspected. The journal's author guideline states AI may not be used to generate manuscript text. The postdoc says they used the LLM as a drafting scaffold and rewrote it substantially. The PI says they were not aware of the AI use. The postdoc is in the final year of their contract and is actively applying for faculty positions. And I actually added this one down here because it does throw a wrinkle in the outputs. So I'll be curious to see what folks get with this. So your job is to answer the question, does this constitute a research integrity violation? And if so, at what level? So here are the steps that you will take as a group in order to carry this exercise out. And we had a meeting a little bit ago, kind of talking about folks that want to learn about this, but may not necessarily want to take up a lot of energy using a lot of these models, right? So we have this one, which I would encourage folks to use if you want to kind of get hands-on experience, and that is to apply advanced prompting techniques. You'll choose 2 on the right side here, and you'll follow these steps. I won't read through all of them. And you can just choose, and I've given you something that you can essentially copy and paste, right? So I've given you a prompt example of each of these, whether it's rereading or chain of thought, program of thought, step back, tree of thoughts, or self-consistency. But if you don't want to use a model, and this is also a little bit of a workshop for me, I'm just trying some things out here. But I know that we had some folks last time that didn't really want to use them. So this is an alternative exercise that you can do to try and go through some similar thought experiments. And this is essentially, you will backwards engineer the case study by tracing out a chronological reasoning log of the hidden assumptions and processing gaps submitted from the postdoc's process. So you will essentially draw out and do a backwards engineering of this case study that will help you communicate with one another. And you'll choose 2 of these 3 in order to carry it out. Again, you don't have to do both. You can do this one, or you can do the one that I kind of originally designed here, but I want folks to know that there are options based on what they're interested in. So let's go ahead and take about 15 minutes or so, form your groups, choose 2 of these prompting strategies or 2 of the lenses if you're not going to use a model, and then go ahead and chat with one another, figure out if a research violation has occurred, and then we will also do some follow-up questions that you can think about too. And again, all of this is available in these slides that you were able to download, all right?
Yeah.
I'll kind of be walking around and facilitating. Other than that, feel free to chat with one another, and we will reconvene in about 20-ish minutes or so. All right, starting to hear some lingering conversations that are traveling elsewhere. So let's come back together here. Let's talk about a couple of these questions here. So with this first question, right, which technique would you actually use the next time you have a genuinely hard question to work through? Maybe you only used a couple of them, maybe none of them worked. Was there anyone that stood out to you as an effective prompt when you compared the 2? Any that you felt better about as maybe opposed to just a default prompt that you would have normally asked? Any opinions, any feelings, thoughts? Yeah.
Well, because we ran agents and we did all of them.
Of course.
And got a table. And, I thought it was really quite valuable. The thing that I'm not so sure that any one of them, Greg, and we've got the table right in front of us. I don't think any one of them in and of itself stood out per se. Our biggest thing in the end was that we asked about the role of the PI because we really thought the postdoc was a fall guy for the PI who really has responsibility for the study. And so actually, that I think that all of the different elements, chain of thought, tree of thought, etc., actually agreed with that.
Mm-hmm. Did any produce a more confident output versus the others, or was there one that was just
we'll get right back to you. We're still trying to evaluate that. Maybe the table. One of the things we have is that each section gives us insight into that, but then there's a roll-up table. Mm-hmm. But actually, the one thing that it said, and it's reminded me of my mother, the lawyer, ignorance is not a defense. So, the PI is really responsible at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And just because the postdoc didn't maybe disclose it, it's up to the PI to be looking at this. So that's just one thing that we came.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll continue to look to see if we liked one of the reasoning other than the other, but I think they all kind of COT was about policy disclosure, policy govern. For TOT, policy not misconduct, principal transparency, and then they listed severities and then the distinct contribution. So COT, cleanest separation of policy breach versus mitigating factors. Self-consistency, just honesty exposes that severity is unsettled. So really, when you pull it together, you can kind of see the different kind of weightings and Like it's like little perceptual differences
Yeah.
between it. It's pretty much I would say overall, wouldn't you, Greg, that they pretty much came up with the same answer.
Yeah, so it could be considered overkill unless you're looking for the minutia. Maybe you just want the yes or no answer, right? Or maybe you do want some of those finer details.
So just for the lab, so we have an agentic system that creates manuscripts and so on.
Mhm.
And what in each member of our lab, a lot of them are sitting here, have different roles. And so what we thought we would do is we would run the system against all the roles in the rules that the journal has and everything else, and use something like this. And we just run all these chain of thoughts and chain of trees and everything else. We just run this script against all the roles that we have, and against, I think the key is you have, and what's maybe missing from here is that you have parts of what the journal said, but we would like to take the journal directions and dump them right in as part of the rack.
Sure. Makes a ton of sense. Some grounding documents, right?
Yeah, anything else, just use those as a grounding document to help this process.
Christina, do you have a thought there?
So we use rereading and chain of thought, but before we even use those, our question was, are the facts clear enough? Because the first fact was that the postdoc used AI to generate the methods. And then another fact was that postdoc said they used it for drafting. And those not necessarily exclude each other.
Right.
Depends on how you look at it and how you interpret it.
I think
if you say it was generated with AI, totally like put the prompt and get the output and use it as the method, that's different than drafting.
It's way different.
Exactly.
I think that points to the value of user judgment.
To
right?
begin with. Then a
That's
striking,
right, Henry, she's right about that.
and then a striking result from both rereading and COT was that the PI was listed as responsible and what they need to do, but not to take responsibility, but how to mitigate the effects in a sense. So in both, the postdoc was listed as the culprit. They did something wrong, the PI was unaware, but they are still somewhat responsible and they need to take action, but they're not fully responsible, which to me, I thought definitely
So
was responsible.
What our system said at the end on that one is ignorance is not a defense. Just because the PI didn't know doesn't get them off the hook. Guilty.
But it sounds like Christina's did kind of say that.
Yeah, so not put them off the hook completely, but said you still have some responsibilities and the PI needs to protect the lab.
Yeah.
It actually listed that the PI needs to protect the lab. It didn't say the PI needs to enforce policies, the PI needs to, they did recommend training the lab on ethics again. But that was about it.
Well, by the way, so that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because I don't even know if I agree with that. I mean, the PI needs to conform to the rules from the editor as well as the research integrity rules of the
that they did say.
I think that kind of points to one of the things I was hoping for here, and that user judgment is still extremely important in all of this, right? You can't just rely on these model outputs as gold, right? By any means. Julia, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Well, Christina, basically, so ours was much more sympathetic, and it said like to the PI and just said like, oh, the postdoc at some point in the prompt it said postdoc has put the PI in a vulnerable position, and it was, I mean, I don't want to, like, hers was much better thought out, but I just thought it was interesting that the response was the opposite of what your response was, Brian. Like, it was definitely flipped, like it was, and it wasn't in fact, though in both I think it said it did not advocate, they kept referring to the nuclear option. Destroying the postdoc's career, and it did not have it kept saying like we don't advocate that, but like it had deep sympathy for the PI.
It's also said initially it's bad at rereading, it's not quite as bad, so it tries to mellow down a little bit rather than
I can.
Well, the interesting thing with one of the things that we saw, it says compare what the AI generated to what was written. And I bring this point up because should everybody be saving your chats as proof that, hey, I didn't AI this? Because how many people are going to sit there and say, oh, AI said this, oh, I'm going to write this up, and then get rid of that because I'm done with it.
Yeah,
We can't delete them in Gemini if we use the enterprise.
True.
So
As well.
they are all
Don't use it.
saved, and one could go back, and if you were the PI and you did Gemini, you could definitely go back to the prompt and compare it to what was written.
So that was in chain of thought only. In the first one rereading, it didn't even ask to compare. It said, okay, that's the fact.
And I think that's really important. It kind of points to these last 2 points up here in terms of a wrap up. I want to make sure that we get to the other exercises here, right? That you still need to be able to audit the model logic, and you can do that with these advanced prompting strategies. But it doesn't mean that these are bulletproof by any means, and you certainly get different answers, although you may get different variations of yes. It seems like it pointed blame to different areas or different parties within this, right? So at the end of the day, your judgment, the domain expertise, the privy to the situation are what really matter in a lot of this, right? And you can really apply that to a lot of scientific backgrounds as well, or a lot of different scenarios in general, right?
Well, the thing about this exercise is somewhat ambiguous is that the Research Integrity Office is institutional.
Mm-hmm.
The rules of the road with regard to the journal is the journal.
Sure.
And I think one has to, look at both of those. And it's, I think, especially problematic because I think we would all agree that we don't have much guidance from our research vice president for research or Rackham or anywhere else at the dean's office.
Yeah.
We're not getting any clear guidelines about the use of this in this particular case from research integrity.
Yeah.
We're not.
I think it's really valuable to be able to educate yourself on all of these things. Hopefully this helps with that and just thinking about it more, right? Yeah, no, I agree. Any last thoughts before we move on here? I want to make sure that we get some hands-on stuff going. Yeah, Christina?
And so first we made the decision without doing the prompts, just looking at the facts and thinking about it, reasoning about it. But then after doing the prompts, we got more ideas, more specific things that we could think of.
Right.
So in that sense, it did help broaden our perspective.
Great sounding board, right?
Yeah.
Both good and bad things.
Yeah.
Brought into.
I think there's a lot of value in that, being able to explore a vaster space with these tools, right?
Yeah.
And fast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So with that, let's go ahead and shift to a little bit of critical thinking and then also using Canvas within Gemini to kind of get familiarity with that, but also to explore some critical thinking and exercise that. So it's a pretty big question. Nobody really has an answer to it per se right now. But that big question is, how do we promote critical thinking in the age of generative AI, right? If you can just click a button for everything, what is the purpose? Why are you here? What is the point if you can just feed all of this into a computer and get an output, right? What's the value in that? How do you differentiate yourself? How do you protect your ability to think and learn? And there have been a lot of different papers out there quite recently talking about how the science and the quality of it goes down, although we are at an all-time high in terms of the growth rate of paper submissions. The quality of those papers can go down, and in general has, because there are so many submissions and people are really just participating in this publisher perish economy, right? And that isn't necessarily the user's fault. It's a systemic problem, but nonetheless, it's something that people are partaking in because of that. And one that just came out, I think it was, let me see here. Okay, so it was a couple months ago.
So old.
Really tough, exactly. In terms of AI age, it is pretty old. But the question it centered around was, is AI turning research into a scientific monoculture, right? With all of the hype, with all of the advances in AI, people feel obligated to use these tools, right? Because it's going to accelerate your ability to do science, to be more efficient. And you also kind of get these incentives to publish that research much faster, right? So you can get more articles out, and then it kind of boosts your resume. And then what happens is you get these emergent dynamics where there's a lot of meta-conformity. That's what they point to in this paper, essentially saying that if everybody is just using all of these tools and all of these are kind of shaping similar thoughts to get similar outputs, then eventually what you have are lost perspectives, so that all of these are merged and you're only getting one perspective with these tools. And you're not really getting any new science that's being generated from the tool itself. And people kind of lose that ability to critically think. Now, that is for those that don't have that expertise background. So you can, if you are a power user, I think as Brian likes to say quite a bit, if you have that domain expertise, right, it can really accelerate your ability to discover new things. But if you're simply going to use this and rely on these tools as more than just a crutch, but essentially your entire dissertation, then what are you really getting out of it? Right? And you can kind of ask the questions, or at least the talking points of this are that this exacerbates that public or parish culture, and that it also reduces cognitive friction, right? So that ability to kind of struggle and kind of work through something when you're being challenged. And then really the question that it kind of inspired me to ask was, how do we preserve the art of asking good questions while becoming more efficient, right? Because that is such an important part. We can't just think about the outputs themselves, right? It is the process more than anything. So when I kind of think about it, before we get into this, right, just my little soapbox spiel here, is that you really have to value the question over the answer in all of this process. And that is kind of just really pivoting scientific training, going from raw output volume, how many papers can you get out of your dissertation or your graduate work, into kind of boundary testing questions, right? So how can you explore the vastness of what you know or the limitations of what you know and expand on that, right? There's got to be more of an emphasis on that. And then also this idea of cognitive friction and how that's being lost. You really have to be able to emphasize that it's okay to sit in uncertainty. Because I think a lot of folks now, especially students that I've had in classes, they really struggle with the idea of not giving a perfect output because they use a lot of these tools, right? And they make great code. They make some great writing overall. But if you're not struggling, you kind of get these diminishing returns overall here. If we think about competence over time, whereas if you are faced with that blank page or that failed loop in your code, you are forced to kind of come up with a solution, right? You're having this iterative interaction over time. And eventually what you get is some deep semantic encoding of new information and really the ability to critically think and learn a lot better than just relying on these tools. And then lastly, right, how do we preserve the art of asking those good questions, right? It's such a big challenge when you have such a powerful tool at your fingertips. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to kind of think about these different forms of reasoning that you can use alongside AI, but not replace with AI. And those are abductive, deductive, and inductive. So abductive, kind of thinking about creative insights overall. Deductive is where you're going from general to specific. So you're looking at a ton of data, then you're coming up with more guided things to investigate. And then finally, you look at some really specific data, and then you are able to synthesize and generalize to a field in order to share your results, right? Those are all things that you really need to press for in order to avoid this crutch and avoid this scientific monoculture. Okay. Off my soapbox there, let's talk a little bit about Gemini Canvas itself and how it can kind of help you with some of those problematic LLM interactions in terms of helping you with efficiency. It can't critically think for you. And that's something that I want to emphasize with every single tool that you're going to use here. It can serve as a great sounding board for you to learn more, but you really have to apply and invest the time in order to learn. So oftentimes when people use these tools, right, almost all of us, when we just open up, we just ask a simple question, straightforward, and that's okay, depending on what our output needs to be. However, something that can be really problematic is that when you're working on a long document, when you ask for help with a specific paragraph or changing something, it'll rewrite the whole thing, right? Maybe it'll give you that output, but then you have to spend the extra time to go ahead and take that paragraph, plug it back into your original text, and kind of navigate through all of that iteration. That takes time, it takes computational power, and it takes creative energy overall. So when we think about Canvas, and we'll walk through this in a second here, there's some really good benefits to it, and then there's also some limitations. So the benefits to this is that when you use long form writing, so if you kind of write a really long paper and you're using Canvas, you can just instantly update this live document that you're working in so that you don't have to reiterate and use all of this computational power to generate an entire document again. It can also be really good for coding and technical work. Now, I would say not nearly as good as some of the Copilot tools that are out there, just because that is much more intuitive, it's much more integrated, and it helps that it doesn't have to rewrite everything. But Canvas on its own can do that. And it does, like I just mentioned, it gives you those living documents that you can interact with. So the tool puts out an output, and then you can change anything from that output that you want in real time. One of the big issues here is that you are limited in the size of the files with this live interaction, right? Gemini is powerful, but it's only so powerful. So you are limited with the size of your script limits. You can't really collaborate with these tools yet. I'm sure this is something that they'll change eventually because they are Google and they are plugged into everything and they own their entire infrastructure all the way to their own models, right? So they have the ability, they have the connections to make this happen. But for now, when you're working on one of these live documents, you can't have multiple people working on it and using these tools at the same time. There are also limited version logs with a lot of these tools. So you can go back to your previous version, but you can't go back to your previous version from 10 days ago very easily without just hitting back, back, back. And it's just really clunky overall compared to a lot of the version control stuff that's out there. And then finally, when you start to get into really large data sets or really large tables or something, this is just not the tool that you want to use because it's going to take a lot of computation and determination for it to give you an output, and it's better to use different tools. Okay, all of that said, if folks want to go ahead and go to Gemini, you can click the plus in the chat window here. I'll actually leave this here and I will bring up my live window so that we can just kind of do this together here. Maybe. Okay, so just click this plus down here. I'll make this full screen here a little bit easier. Okay, so if you just click the plus down here, oops, you should have the option to choose Canvas amongst other things, as you might see. But if you choose Canvas here, you can simply type a prompt in, any prompt that you want. For me, right, I said, help me write a detailed manuscript outline that compares and contrasts the properties of computer viruses and bacteriophage with a special emphasis on the traits of each when considering the 7 well-known characteristics of living organisms, right? So I want to kind of explore this front because it's interesting and funny to me. But I give it that prompt. I am in Canvas mode here. And it gives me a detailed publication grade manuscript outline that I can open. And if I click open, what you see is that now I have on the right this live document, right? So you can kind of think of this on the left as your typical chat. This is going to be the big picture thinking that you should be considering, right? And then on the right here, you actually have your live documentation. So this is just a real, essentially Google Doc that you can scroll through. Pretty detailed outline overall. And one of the things that you can do is that, let's say that we're looking at this and I say, you know what, this is way too long, this introduction here. So I can just highlight the entire introduction. And if I use one of these side scroll bars over here, you can see that I can change the length, you can change the tone, and you can also suggest edits. So if we go to change length here, right now it's just at the average length. Let's go all the way to very short. So now it's going to think for a little bit. Again, this is our live document on the right. It is computing. It is considering what it should do in this. Notice that I am in the Flash option here. I would advise you to not use the Pro just because that's going to use a lot of power. It's not really necessary for this exercise here. But you'll see that in real time, it is rewriting this live document.
Could be good.
Still updating, making some final changes here. And then what it does is it actually highlights the portions that have been changed from that. So you can see all of what has happened there. And if you don't like it, you can simply go back to the previous version and it will change it. So all of this is what was changed. They essentially took out a lot of this blue and they left only the unhighlighted version there. Okay, so you can do that, or you can make it really, really long, right? So you can do the opposite of that. I won't do that just because it's going to take longer for it to think here. And I want to show you all of the different features here, but realize that's also an option. Let's say you're looking at this introduction and you think that it is a little too formal, which is probably not the way that you would go, given that you are trying to put this into a scientific manuscript. But let's say that we want to make it very casual instead. So I've selected this introduction and now it is going to update. It's going to be in the chat window over here. Define the objective. It's going to go through all of the different iterations that it's looking for in order to give me a more varied, general, casual tone. And it's actually really shortened the introduction here.
Wait, you can't.
And you can see that it's certainly changed the language. It now says the lowdown on viruses and phages, how digital bugs became a thing, phages, nature's original gangster viruses. While it's still thinking here. There we go. So everything else stays intact when you do this, okay? And then finally, let's say that I just wanted to highlight the abstract here. And I'm going to ask Gemini to suggest some edits for it. So I can suggest some edits.
Serious. Part of it. I can see part of the problem with this is I'm very familiar with all this, having even had to teach all this. I mean, so it's one thing if you know it, but it's another thing if you don't know it.
Can you say
You
more
don't even
about
know
that?
if it's true or not.
Oh, what it's expanding on? 100%.
I'm serious.
Yeah, you need to evaluate every single AI output. No question. No question. I can't emphasize that enough. So when I've asked it to suggest edits, it's highlighted the areas that it's added, and then it's also given some chats on the side here that kind of act like user comments if you were editing a doc with somebody else. You can expand it if it does say anything, and then you can decide whether you want to apply any given suggestion here, whether you want to apply all, or you can just ignore them all right? So then, and I'll kind of just go back here because it'll be a little bit easier. There's some other stuff that you can do with this tool. Some of it I think is a little bit gimmicky, but some of it can be kind of helpful too. If you go up here to this window up here that says create, there are a few different options for you, whether you want to use or create a web page, an HTML page that's interactive, an infographic, create a quiz on the content, flashcards, an audio overview, which I actually looked on my UMish account, and I don't think that you can create this audio overview for some reason. I'm not sure exactly why, but it wasn't an option. But no, with a personal account like this, that you could create an audio overview. It's kind of similar to Notebook LM. But let's say that I wanted to check out a web page. Let's see where I found that here.
Yeah, I'm game.
I know you are. Good.
Oh, I guess what I could do, what's going to be the easiest here. Okay. All right. So this is what the output, and anybody could click on this, the output of the HTML creator would do, just given the content that you are providing for it in the Canvas page there. So overall, it looks okay. I mean, it's kind of run of the mill, but it's a lot better than something I could do in 2 minutes, that's for sure. You have different things that you can cycle through in terms of whether you are considering a digital virus or a biological phage. It also talks about the different pathways, the life cycle pathways of each of them, whether it wants to be an active and destructive form or a passive and stealth form. You get a spider plot like this that breaks down where each of these different types of viruses falls in the spectrum of life based on those different criteria. You also get some recommendations here about different ways that they might infect. And then with this, you can actually add Gemini features, which will look at this entire page that you've created, and it will suggest different outputs on how to make it more interactive, usually more interactive, I would say. Just as an example, when I asked it to add Gemini features to this, it created a co-evolutionary arms race simulator. And it was kind of cool because you could select these different types of either host defense systems for bacteriophage or digital hosts, the pathogen mutation strategy, and it would run an interactive simulation, kind of like the Oregon Trail, a little bit there. but you can kind of select and ask different areas of these outputs to anything in your Canvas file, and it can help to rewrite and redesign that. And then you can also create things like a visual summary, which when I saw infographic, I kind of thought of something different. But you'll see that it does kind of look like the HTML output overall, but it's a little more simplified. It does have the SIR model in there, I guess. But then with this, when I just type in the chat, for instance, that I'm looking for an infographic based on the conversation that we're having, it actually does give me just a PNG output as opposed to an entire HTML representation. Something worth noting. And then, like I said, you can also create outputs that are like quizzes if you're looking to review content or maybe generate some quizzes. I would say like all of the questions aren't the best per se, but you can get some good ideas over there. Again, a great sounding board overall. You can also create some pretty good flashcards for studying. An audio overview, I won't play it for you based on the time that we have left here, but you can get usually about a 5-minute summary of all of the content that's there. You can also do things like describe your own app, and that's actually something that you're going to do for this exercise that we have coming up here. So with this, I was able to make a cross-substrate viral simulator. If anybody's used a Vita before to simulate experiments with populations and competition, it was famous from MSU and the Richard Lenski experiments, looking at the evolution of E. coli. You were basically able to create this and modify it within 10 minutes, and you had something that was pretty usable overall, I think. And then I was kind of just playing around. I made my own version of the Oregon Trail, except it's called the Infection Trail. I don't know if anybody played this when they were growing up, but I definitely did. But it even has, music that comes with it.
You still get dysentery?
What's that?
Do you still get dysentery?
Not with this, but there are some other things that come up. So with this, you can either choose to be a bacteriophage or a digital virus, and then you choose whether you want the lytic strategy or the lysogenic strategy, and then you kind of just travel here. And the goal is to get to a certain depth. Again, this is something that was entirely generated by the tool. I gave it a little bit of guidance in terms of some of the decision making, but now we're facing some thermal fever shock, not dysentery, something a little bit different there. But you can cycle between lytic and lysogenic, which is a little more protective. And then you'll face some restriction endonucleases. What do you want to do? Spend one adaptation point, this type of thing, right? So a little bit gimmicky, but also kind of fun if you ever thought that you wanted to make a video game but couldn't, right? So this took about an hour overall, but it was fun to play around with. But it is something that can be done directly within this describing your own app experience for Gemini's Canvas tool. Okay, so show all of that. Now I really want to put it into your hands to kind of play around with here. So we're going to talk a little bit about, or I guess I should say that you guys will talk a little bit about some controversial hypotheses that are out there. And what I want you to do is kind of consider the fact that AI models will often default to a consensus bias, right? So a lot of the data that they're trained on, if it points to one direction, they will often lean that way. Oftentimes, they also like to ride the fence because they don't want to upset the user. They want you to keep subscribing. So that is something to consider as well. So your task is to go ahead and use the Canvas tool to write a strong formal argument for or against one of these hypotheses over here. And these are a little bit controversial, saying things like AI will soon solve the protein folding problem entirely. Human language is learned through pattern recognition with no innate linguistic structure. Gut bacteria rather than neural activity are the primary drivers of complex human personality. All of these things, right? Pretty strong takes overall. But what I'd like you to do is to use the Canvas tool to write a for or against argument for these. And I want you to evaluate, critically think about the outputs that it gives you, whether you can actually validate those outputs. And then to also kind of just play around with a few of these different tools that are in there. I kind of pointed to some of them, whether it be creating an infographic or changing the length, suggesting edits, making a web page. And if you have time to also make an interactive app that's related to your hypothesis. All right. So I'm going to leave a lot of this up to you. Again, you are the driver for this. I'll walk around and help people out if they have any questions. But we'll take probably, I know that says 30 minutes, but I think we can make some good progress in about 20 minutes. I want to make sure that we can make a gem or two before we leave here. All right. Questions on anything there? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'll be walking around to help. All right, so let's reconvene here. Want to make sure we have enough time left. overall, what do people think about the speed of it? Did it feel somewhat intuitive, or did you feel like maybe it was better than just kind of going between windows of the chat here and then flip into a Google Doc? Did it feel any better? Did it feel useful at all? Potentially. Not at all. No info.
Well, initially when we did it, it just spit out some arguments. Then we told it to cite some resources. And then it put a reference section at the bottom and, put some quotes, scattered it throughout the document. So
did you have a chance to check the resources or the sources?
No.
Yeah. I'd be curious to see what those look like. Yeah, Christina?
So mostly it just definitions and specific formulas. I use the prompt for language. I think it was the second question that we had, the second hypothesis that we were giving arguments for. And there were some sources, but no citations at the end, just the name of the authors and year.
Right.
I didn't get to verify the sources to see if that paper exists and if that
it should
out.
Certainly still be a process overall of
because it generates quite a lot, so it takes some time to.
And that can be a problem, right? And that's also, people see these outputs, these lengthy outputs, and they just assume that it's going to be really good, right? They've provided all this information, but you do still have to validate.
And I mean, the good thing about it, we can make it shorter or longer if we want to.
It can be.
And adjusting the tone also helped with some things, but making it more casual, left room for interpretation, making it more formal, made it harder to understand.
Interesting. Yeah. Any other feelings, insights, opinions?
Actually, with Christina's point, I'm not really expecting an answer, but where do we put the slider when we're going, via super formal to super casual? I know it depends on our audience, but when we're talking to the average person.
I think it's all about what's your goal? What are you trying to relay, right? Is it a instructional prompt to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or is it how to build a rocket? I don't know, right? Vastly different. Yeah. So it certainly is case by case, I would say.
Then when I expanded it, actually it brought both things. Some things made more clear, but some not. When I said expand the next.
Yeah, that can certainly happen. Yeah, and I guess that might help to be able to highlight a specific sentence that you wanted to change and leave everything else, kind of a thing. Okay, so overall, I think the general sense is that you still need to validate everything, even if it can spit it out for you really quickly. Oftentimes, what you want to remember is that you need to be a pilot, not a passenger. You still had to drive it quite a bit, right? Even though it could produce a lot of that output text. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of the time that we have left together just talking about gems, do a little bit of an exercise here, and then we can get out of here and enjoy some sunshine. So I won't spend too much time on this just for the sake of time, but it is always important to be thinking about the impacts on the environment, using these tools, trying to use them efficiently, responsibly. And it really comes from a lot of different tiers, as you can see here, all the way at the top at the highest with the policy down to infrastructure, models, and users. With policy, that kind of looks like, making sure that operators are reporting what types of energy they're using, making sure that there are hard legal deadlines for clean energy use, also making sure that data centers that are being created are running very efficiently. You want to make sure that the primary purpose of these built data centers is that they are just powering the IT equipment, not also spending that power on air movement and cooling and all of these things, right? So there are actually standards that are being set in place. It's referred to as the PUE, where you are trying to make sure that these are as efficient as possible. Ideally, almost all of the power would be devoted to running the actual chips and hardware themselves and less on the data center as a whole. From the infrastructure standpoint, there are some developments that are being made, right? So last time I kind of talked about a lot of the negative effects. I did want to point out that there are some things that people are doing to try and make these more efficient. Still not saying they are good or bad or anything like that, but there are approaches being taken in order to make them more efficient. whether that be using cooling racks. So now they have racks up there that are fully submerged. This liquid helps keep them cool. That's also why Elon Musk wants to put them out in space, because it's really cool out there. You also get the solar energy, but it is expensive to initially put them out there in the first place. You can also try to avoid waste of heat in distribution. There's a study that's been done that kind of looked at the soil and surface temperatures and saw how much warmer they were closer to data centers versus further away. And there's a pretty dramatic difference overall. But then you can also try to optimize data centers and make them run more efficiently by using carbon intelligent workload shifting. So really trying to run them at optimal times, whether that is a specific time of the day or using it when there are low carbon grids and specific time windows as well. And then at a model standpoint, you can do a bunch of different things to try and optimize these so that you are making more lean models. You're using sparser matrices so they don't have to perform all of these calculations at once. You're using a really powerful model with distillation and distilling it into a student model from a teacher model, so that instead of running 100 billion parameters, now you're only running 8 billion. And you're basically answering the same questions depending on what your overall goal is. You may not need those other 92 billion parameters. You can do things like quantization, where you may sacrifice a little bit of accuracy, but it really, really cuts down on the computational costs. And it can still be okay depending on the outputs that you're looking for. And then you can finally do some things like pruning these models so that they aren't using as many computational interactions overall, and then also retraining only a small subset of the model to run more efficiently when it needs to be updated. All of those are ways at the model level to improve the overall efficiency of these AI tools. And then finally, at the user level, a lot of us there, right, operating there, is to really understand the real cost of each prompt. And there have been some studies out there, and I do want to warn you that there are just so many varying pieces of information out there in terms of how much a chat actually costs, whether it is a thinking or a flash output or a pro output. Even all of that varies depending on the query that's being used to begin with. That said, it's still going to be more expensive than a Google search, although now all of your Google searches have AI incorporated into them, right? So there is that to consider as well. Even if a lot of us use Great Lakes Cluster to run computations, right? Depending on when you run and submit those and those batch jobs get run, that can really cut down on the computational cost from an energy standpoint as well. And then finally, just really being more upfront about looking for these companies to tell you how much each of these costs, which they have really no incentive to do other than being transparent. I will say Mistral over in France does a really, really good job about being upfront, being eco-friendly, and being transparent. So I do give them kudos, even though they are by no means one of the leaders overall in terms of those flagship models. They are still trying overall. Do you want to say anything, Christina?
Yeah, I had a comment, and I think that's the key point: transparency and how we can have this data to actually evaluate. But then I was thinking, since I come from a computer science background and I've been told a lot, and I told people maybe I shouldn't read the manual, right, for something. Maybe the AI tools could also tell people that are asking a definition or something like that, here's the Wikipedia page, rather than writing a full-on description or other things like that. Mm-hmm. Or here is the manual for this tool that you're asking about. So making it less costly. I know they won't do it right now because they're trying to get people to use it and don't want to make them not use the tool. Mm-hmm. But I think that would be a way to save some energy, some money, and get the same results.
I think there are a lot of ways
very similar.
We can become more efficient.
And with coding, I've seen people both in academia and industry have code bases that they don't know anymore. And they're asking the AI, where is the file that contains this? Yeah. Which it boggles my mind, because how can you get that to production, or how can you get that into a paper if you don't understand what's in there?
Yeah, it's a real problem. Yeah. And I think it'll become more of a problem, especially if we aren't doing our part to keep training experts as opposed to just relying on these tools.
To your point, Christine, even Google searches now use AI. So every single goofy search that you used to do, and it would just come back, here's your stuff, it's now, anticipating what you're asking.
I think you can turn that off. I think you can use the classic search if you want to, but you need to turn it off. It's not by default off to turn it on.
Right.
And many people don't. So
absolutely. So in the vein of being more efficient, right, you can actually use something that is known as a Gemini gem. I'm going to show you how to do that here. And I kind of want to just explain why you might use it and what it looks like without one versus with one, right? So without one, oftentimes we'll use these chats and they can become redundant in terms of saying that we want to do something. Maybe we want to make a schedule maker, or we want to review a document or something, and we have a very specific set of instructions that we want to use. But every single time we are putting that into the chat, and then it has to take that as an input. That costs more tokens. The output, all of that computation adds up, right? So then you're finding that you're always pasting these rules back in, pasting this persona back in, telling it how to act. And you can spend a lot of time just doing that, right? And using a lot of computation that way. But if you use a gem, right, you can kind of build something. I don't want to call it agentic because I don't feel it is that, but it gives you a little bit of a feel for what it's like to create an agent. One with, I would say, less options and then also less autonomy. But you kind of get an idea of what it's like to give this tool a manual for how to act. So with this, you can give it things like instructions, a persona, constraints, and then you create this gem, and that's just always baked in there. So then you can just ask a question or give it a prompt immediately, and it has that entire list of constraints and rules to automatically take your input and give you the output that you're looking for. It saves you a ton of time, and it can also just make you a lot more efficient in that sense as well. So if you go back to just your home page of Gemini, you have the new chat over here. And then at the very bottom, you have this thing that looks like a diamond or a gem. And if you open that up, what you'll see is that you have options that are made by Google. So those are preloaded. Or you can also create a custom gem or a new gem, and that's down at the bottom here. Now, just as an example, I have a ton over here that I created, but I'll show you one of them that's at the top there, and that's where I essentially take a video, and then I convert that into a transcript, any YouTube video, and then you can take those bullet points and convert those into slides, and then you make an entire presentation just from using this gem. So when should you actually build a gem, right? You want to be able to satisfy these criteria. You want to be able to use it often. You want it to be for a task that wouldn't be very simple and straightforward, like looking up the capital of Kazakhstan or getting a quick article summary for something like that, right? Something that is a little more in-depth than that. And then finally, something that you are using for a consistency output, right? So a long-term project requiring an AI to stay in character for a long time, right? That is something that you would use. That's also something, if you were to design an agent, you give it a persona, you give it a list of rules and guidelines. You want it to be able to adhere to those for a long time until you give it a new set of instructions. So if we were to go, and you can actually kind of just follow along here if you want, if you click and build a new gem, so you are going to that main site, which looks like this. You click the gem icon, and then you go down to new gem. When you go down there and you click the plus by new gem, it'll give you a page that looks like this. And there are really 5 required inputs that you need in order to make a gem, right? The first thing, you have to name it. You have to give it a name there. For instance, you could just say it's a statistical consultant or inclusive design auditor, anything like that. It's just a short descriptive label that you know to identify later. On top of that, or the next thing I should say, is that you give it a description, and this is really just 1 or 2 sentences explaining what it does, just vaguely. So if somebody else were to use it, they could just figure out what it's going to be good for. You have to be concise with it, and then you will be able to get a better feel for whether it's useful for you or not. So for instance, I could say a biostatistician advisor that recommends appropriate tests, right? Something that's just pretty straightforward like that. After that, this is where you really give it that core set of instructions, right? All of those rules, all of those constraints, that core system prompt, as we would often refer to it when talking about models. So you have the persona, so how is it going to act? Who is it going to be? The task, what is the overall goal? The constraints, what should it absolutely not do? And then an output format, right? So maybe a structured format that you're looking for. And that's where the GEMS logic really lives overall. With this, the 4th thing that it'll ask you to do is to select a tool to use. And if you click on the default tool button by it, you'll see a list of things that you can select from, whether it be create an image or create a video, Canvas, create music, guided learning, all of those. I typically just keep it on no default tool. right? Because then it's able to access any of these as opposed to something specific. Now, maybe you do want something specific, entirely up to you. This is something that's optional. I usually just kind of gloss over it. And then finally, and this could be one of the most important things aside from the system prompt itself, and those are the knowledge files. So the last thing that you're able to input is this little section that's called knowledge. And with this, you can upload SOPs or specific guidelines, or maybe a paper that reinforces the logic that you're interested in, or a spreadsheet that has a lot of values that are of importance to you that it can use to help you build a schedule or a finance sheet, anything like that, right? You can also, and I've done this before, you can not only upload files, but you can link it to a notebook LM. And if anybody remembers those from last time, you can essentially build a huge knowledge base, and then it can link out to that knowledge base. And then you have something that is rooted in ground truths that you're able to access. And that's a huge, huge benefit, because then it's not really going out on the web to give you answers. It is referring to that knowledge base. All right. So just as an example, I talked about how I made a video transcript extraction and bullet point organization tool right here. You need to tell it first, who is the gem? You set an identity and a vocabulary baseline. After that, you say what the gem must never do. I say, do not summarize or use code placeholders, output the complete data set. Basically saying that it needs to go over the whole video and make sure that it is talking about all of the important points of a video. Give it a specific task or the primary explicit goal. For this, I said that it has to give me 2 parts. It's got to give me a chronological raw slide outline, and then it's also got to give me a JavaScript presentation module, right? And the reason I did that is before I tried to actually make it just do the slides for me right in that right away. And it always had issues with that. But when I asked for the code, I could just take that code, copy and paste it in there, and then it would make really good slides for me. And then finally, for this, I didn't use any knowledge documents, but for a lot of the other gems that I created, I did, especially something like a journal matcher. You could give all of those different journal criteria and feed it in there, and then it would give you an idea of whether that article that you're writing would be a good fit for a specific journal or not. So it can be really useful in that sense. And then this is just kind of an output of what it looked like. I get a raw outline of slides that I could create, convert into a presentation. I get the actual code. I copy that code. I get a presentation, and there's actually what it looks like, or at least some of the slides that were output. Okay. So every time you make one of these gems, you want to kind of test it at every instructional stage or when you make different changes to it. You want to first go down the happy path, which is essentially just a standard easy request. Does it do what you asked it to do? And then you want to give it an edge case, something that's kind of on the outer bounds of what it could do potentially. And then you also want to ask it or give it an out of scope prompt to ask it to stay in its lane, essentially making sure that it doesn't go out of what it's designed to do. And then finally, you want a constraint test, and that's just verifying that all of the formatting or the styles or the outputs, how you want it to look, actually works, right? So this is something that you should think about every time you make one of these, just to make sure that it's actually staying on point for you. Okay, we obviously don't have 30 minutes. We have 10 minutes left. So what I would ask that you do is essentially just try to create a gem. So just go to that, create anything that you think might be useful for you. I would encourage you to create one that you would use for something that's really repetitive in your life or a repetitive task. Maybe it's scheduling, maybe it is a weekly planner, maybe it's experimental design for something that you have to change well plates for or something. Just something that's really iterative that would normally take you a lot of time. I would encourage you to do that. And you can refer to the slides that I put there as an example, and it kind of gives you a feel for what you might be looking for in terms of instructions. Now, if you wanted to use these hypotheses and this entire exercise that I came up with, feel free. You can take it home with you. It's yours forever at no cost to you. But just get a little bit of hands-on experience with this before you go. And I'll kind of just walk around. Feel free to ask me any questions on making one, and then we can go from there. And then because we have so little time, we'll end with this exercise, but I do appreciate everybody coming here. Hopefully you learned a little something. You can always reach out to me. My email is at the very end there. It's just my name, ajwing@medmich.edu. And I'm just across the hall if anybody ever has any questions too. So thanks for coming in. I appreciate it.